Howdy everyone, and today I'm looking at one of the most famous fast aperture vintage lenses available, one with a bit of a cult following. I'm testing a Helios 44-2 58mm f2 lens. I don't normally review vintage lenses, but I had so many requests to look at this one that I couldn't resist, so I'm bending the rules just this once. The Russians made millions of these in different variations, and they can be found on eBay for only as little as £10 or $15 US. For a lens with an aperture as wide as f2, that's pretty incredible. You can get pictures like this on your camera using a lens that costs £10. Pretty amazing, right? Although I should mention that you'll also need to get an appropriate adapter for it to work on your camera. This copy of the lens uses the old M42 screw mount, so I'll be testing it with this lovely M42 to Canon EOS adapter, which can easily be found on eBay for about £6. The adapter you use has no real effect on image quality. These lenses were manufactured from 1958 until the 90s, and this is the nicest copy that I could find on eBay, made in the late 80s and in tip-top condition, which set me back £25. You can find whole forums on the internet devoted to divulging information on the various versions of this lens, but the 44-2 has some interesting optical characteristics and seems to be the most common variety. On a full-frame camera, 58mm is a nice standard focal length, giving a fairly wide but out-of-focus background at f2. Put this lens on an APS-C camera and it'll behave like a short telephoto portrait lens, as you can see here. And an aperture as wide as f2 will obviously give you some very out-of-focus backgrounds, and it lets in lots of light. The Helios is, of course, a completely manual lens. The focus ring turns a massive 300 degrees and it runs extremely smoothly, being very well damped. It's a pleasure to use. The lens's aperture can stop down to f16. There's a little oil on this lens's aperture blades. If this were a lens where the aperture was camera controlled, then that would be a bit of an issue, but for a manual aperture lens, it's nothing really to worry about. The aperture control on this lens can be a little confusing at first. It uses a preset aperture design with two aperture rings. The lower aperture ring turns extremely smoothly, and that's a nice feature for video makers, as it means you can precisely control your light levels as you shoot, as you can see here. For some people that's quite a bonus. But the dial works the wrong way round. At the marking for f2, the lens is actually stopped down to f16. And at the marking for f16, the lens's aperture is wide open at f2. What's going on? Well, it's an old preset aperture system. There's actually another control ring at the top, which clicks rather stiffly between each f-stop. If you click that control ring down to f4, for example, then you'll only be able to stop the aperture down as far as, you guessed it, f4. As you can see here, you can easily turn from f2 to f4 now, in the middle of shooting, without having to stop and look down at your lens in the process. On old SLR cameras, the idea was that this system would allow you to compose your picture at f2 with the viewfinder at its brightest, and then stop the aperture down to whatever you preset it to, just before you take the picture. It's an interesting concept, and if you're happy to shoot this manual focus lens using your camera's viewfinder, then that method could still be useful to you today. Personally, I always shoot manual focus lenses using live view mode though. Anyway, the lens's body is tightly assembled and made of metal, making it a tough little thing that's a pleasure to use. You just have to get used to manual focus and away you go. Let's look now at the all-important picture quality. This should be interesting. We'll start on a full-frame camera, a 20-megapixel Canon 6D. At the widest aperture of f2, the picture doesn't have much contrast. But if we take a look at the middle of the image, we can see that it's actually very sharp indeed. That's potentially useful for portrait shooting. Unfortunately though, when we look into the corners, image quality quickly falls to pieces, displaying incredible softness and what seem to be serious problems with chroma. There really is only a small sweet spot of sharpness in the middle of the image frame. Stop down to f2.8 for more brightness and contrast in those corners, but not much more sharpness. picture quality in the middle of the image now is wonderful though. There really is a lot more contrast at f2.8. Stop down again to f4 for bitingly sharp resolution in the middle of the picture, but again, the edges remain quite blurry. Things are better at f5.6, and there's a clear enough picture in the corners at f8. Stop down to f11 or f16 for pretty sharp corners. So on a full frame camera, the lens is always sharp enough for portrait pictures where your subject is in the middle of the image frame, although contrast levels are quite low at f2. But for sharpness anywhere away from the middle, you need to stop down to about f11. Let's take a look at image quality when the lens is used on an APS-C camera, in this case a 20 megapixel Canon 70D. Interestingly, it's about the same performance. At f2, the lens is sharp in the middle of the picture, although contrast levels are low. The corners of the image are extremely soft. Stop down to f2.8 for a touch more clarity in those corners and a lot more contrast, and in the middle of the image we see great sharpness and contrast. Picture quality at f4 is perfect in the middle, but still weak in the corners. f5.6 is still weak, but at f8 the picture quality becomes good. If you stop down the aperture anymore, then the image will just get softer due to the effect of diffraction. So the Helios 44-2 bravely puts up some fight on an APS-C camera with good sharpness in the middle of your pictures. Those corners really are quite soft though, never mind. Let's look at vignetting and distortion levels on a full frame camera. They're not really a problem on APS-C. The good news is that the lens projects almost no distortion, a nice characteristic. At f2 we see some rather dark corners though. At f2.8 that vignetting is reduced, but it's only when you stop down to about f8 that the corners become uniformly bright. The lens can focus as closely as 50 cm, which is only a little further than average for a standard lens. At f2, the close-up picture quality is a touch soft, but not too bad. Stop down to f2.8 for an improvement, and at f4, close-up picture quality is pretty sharp. Let's see how well the lens works against bright lights. Unsurprisingly, for such an old lens design, we see a lot of very clear flaring, as well as a drop in contrast. It looks pretty enough, but it is a technical problem. Finally, let's look at the bokeh, or the quality of this lens's out of focus backgrounds. Here's where things get interesting. If you're using a full frame camera, then the 44-2 can yield a beautiful swirly-bokeh effect when you're the right distance from your subject. Due to physical vignetting, the bokeh around the edges of your image looks noticeably swirly and curved around, like an old Petzval lens. It's really fun getting those images, actually, although unfortunately it only really works well if you're using a full frame camera. When you stop down the lens's aperture a bit, you get normal bokeh again, which is actually very nice and smooth indeed. At the end of the day, the Helios 44-2 is a quirky and fun lens to use, and it's worth a punt. It's only about £10 after all. It's certainly something different. It'll be appreciated by APS-C camera owners who are on a very tight budget and want to get some portrait pictures, and it'll be appreciated by full-frame camera users who want to get busy with some swirly-bokeh. Add a bit of contrast to your shots afterwards and you'll have some nice results on your hands. Recommended.